Hi sociologists, this is Mrs. T, and this is a continuation of the video about marriage as a social institution that was taken just a little bit too long. Imagine Mrs. T talking a little bit too much when she gets excited about a topic. Sorry, it was a little bit long, and so I didn't get to talk to you about cohabitation, which was also on the board behind me during the marriage video. So you already have a little bit of notes about what cohabitation is. So I wrote something a little bit different on the board right now. It should essentially have the same information or relate to the information that you already have in your notes. So today, think of this as a continuation of marriage as a social institution, and we're going to look at domestic partnerships because as sociologists we have to look at all of the cases that exist across the board and don't leave any standard behaviors out. So we're going to look at divorce also because divorce is part of the social institution that we call marriage. You'll notice that despite the funny reflections on the board, I'm sorry that I have these funny reflections on the board. I'm doing the best I can with this reflection stuff. But anyway, divorce is also part of this chapter because it's a reality of our society, right? So those are the two topics that we're going to talk about today. Okay. So you will recall, and you need your notes about marriage in front of you, you will recall that marriage has some key words at the very beginning of the definition. It says that it must be legally and or socially recognized in a society in order for the kind of relationship that's called a marriage to be accepted as a marriage. So cohabitation is, in our culture anyways, cohabitation in United States culture is something that is very commonly done this day and age. Back when I was your age, and I'm really not so ancient compared to you, but back when I was your age, it was not as openly done as it is today. There were many people that did it back in the 80s and 90s in the last century, but it was a little bit stigmatized still at that day and age, even though it was becoming increasingly common. So there used to be a social stigma, a significant social stigma associated with cohabitation, which, like your grandma might say, means shacking up, which means there's not a marriage associated with the relationship. However, I mentioned the beginning of the marriage definition, the legal and or socially recognized part of that marriage definition, because the socially recognized part is specific to a relationship called a marriage. And in our society, marriages have a legal condition as a requirement in order to be called a marriage. Cohabitation occurs when unmarried people live together not as roommates, but as monogamous couples who have a sexual relationship. Their friends, their family, their co-workers, etc., understand that they are a couple. So when I say here that cohabitating people are recognized informally as a couple, the informal part means that there is no marriage associated with it, because marriage in our culture and in many cultures that are influenced by Western tradition around the world, marriages that occur in our culture must have the legal component in order to be valid. Cohabitating people do not have legal protections that marriage provides. You'll have to go back to that video just before this about marriage when I go over what some of those rights and obligations and legal protections are associated with marriage. Cohabitating couples don't have that. All you have to do is watch a good 2-3 days worth of Judge Judy episodes to find a couple or two who come before her in her court of law, and they were shacking up, like your grandmama maybe frowns when she says it, and they've broken up, and it was a bad breakup, and now he won't take my name off the title, and she's ruined my my credit, and I paid for the washer and dryer, and he won't give them back, etc. Those kinds of things come in front of Judge Judy's court. And if you love Judge Judy like I love Judge Judy, you know exactly what she has said over the years. Nowadays, she's pretty tame. She'll say things like, courts don't offer you a protection, or courts don't deal with the kind of issues that you're talking about. If you wanted to commingle, there's one you can look up. If you wanted to commingle your money and act like you were married when you really weren't, that's your problem, Judge Judy would say, because courts don't offer legal protections for cohabitating couples. So, cohabitating couples might not have legal protections for equitable distribution of property, but they also don't have legal rights to make some of the same decisions or have some of the same access to information and finances that we described in the marriage video. So these legal protections don't only govern the breakup, should there be one, but they would also govern not being able to be considered a next of kin when an accident or an illness occurs, not having access to medical decision making or rights to inherit property. That would simply be an issue that the families of the rightful heirs or the legal heirs of the people involved would just simply need to behave politely with each other and work it out in the way that they see is fair. But the court, probate, those kinds of things will not step in and be on the side of, say, the surviving part of the couple when there wasn't a legally recognized marriage. So cohabitation is very, very common these days, and Judge Judy doesn't like it, and probably your grandma doesn't either, but it's very, very common, and sociologists are interested in the reasons why so many people opt to cohabitate instead of getting married, because in olden days, the typical way of doing things was the couple would not live together or keep house with each other until marriage took place, until they moved out, until marriage took place, typically. There are many groups today, religious followers, for instance, who still hold to that tradition. However, in the secular world, many people say that they cohabitate before marriage to test the waters to see if you are really compatible with your partner enough for living together on a day-to-day basis to work out. That's one of the answers that sociologists get when they do micro-scale investigations of the reasons behind cohabitation. A lot of times also you will hear people say, well, when I was a kid, my parents went through a divorce that really scarred me, even though maybe they treated me okay, and I'm not saying that the parents treated the child badly, but just witnessing that often can give a person in adulthood, when now it is your turn to follow the norms of society and make your own family of procreation. Go back 2 or 3 videos to find that word. Often people opt to cohabitate instead. There's an issue when children are produced. However, cohabitating couples tend to have extra legal processes to go through in order for a child to be legitimately to be an heir. What am I trying to say? For a child to automatically have access to, say, Social Security benefits of a parent who is deceased, or for a child to have access to health benefits through a non-married parent's work, for instance. There are some extra legal things that you have to go through. It's possible. It's very possible to do it. It's just a little bit of extra hoops you have to jump through in order to make that child legitimate. So that's where you get the term legitimate versus illegitimate children. The legit part is legal. There are no legal protections for cohabitating or non-married parents of dependent children. So that legitimate versus illegitimate children, that's where that comes from. If you don't have a recognized marriage, then there's extra paperwork. Sometimes you have to pay for legal services to do that kind of thing. There's extra stuff that you have to go through, and that's one of the reasons why cohabitation is not ideal for the current legal status of marriage and inheritance rules and rights and obligations associated with finances and medical care and that kind of thing. So, cohabitation. A lot of times people say that they try it out to make sure that they are compatible before marriage, but statistics show, and I don't have the statistics off the top of my head right now, statistics change all the time, so even if I quoted you the old statistics that I think were true from like 2014 or something, whenever I started asking Siri and stopped memorizing statistics, studies show that people who cohabitate before marriage tend to end in divorce at higher rates than people who did not cohabitate before marriage. So there are some interesting things for sociologists to look at regarding that piece of information. And like I said, you can ask Siri, you can Google the rates of divorce among people who cohabitated prior to marriage and the divorce rates among people who did not cohabitate prior to marriage. The divorce rates are higher for those who cohabitated. It's an odd pattern, perhaps, because the reason that these people say they cohabitate is to check on their compatibility. And so I guess you would decide that you're compatible if you go ahead and marry eventually after your period of cohabitation. But studies show that it ends in divorce more often than people who didn't cohabitate before marriage. I think that's the third time I said that. It's just an accident. I'm not emphasizing that for any kind of test question reason. Anyway, divorce is not an uncommon thing, but again, back in the day, it was something that was not socially accepted, and it was very stigmatized. Females in general have a lot of stigma associated with their responsibility, their assumed responsibility for the reasons behind divorce. A lot of organizations like churches, some churches, I'm thinking about Southern Baptist right now, a friend of mine is from Southern Baptist Church, and there seems to be a little bit of an unspoken bias about the female's role in a divorce when or if it happens. That's my unscientific observation, but I've also in casual discussion with others, I've had them mention, oh yeah, that seems to be the case. So divorce does not carry with it universally across society in the secular world. Perhaps in certain religious circles, it still has a stigma, but divorce is not stigmatized in just a secular USA norms kind of way anymore. Divorce is very common, and it is a legal undoing of the marriage. In a divorce, you will see court protections of community property brought into a marriage. In some cases, when a state observes what we call a common law marriage, some of you might have heard of a common law marriage, that occurs in some states that have that statute, and I do not believe Arkansas has that statute anymore. I think they used to, and that's another thing you can Google. You can ask Siri about that. But in some states, if a couple cohabitated or cohabitates for a certain period of time, I'm going to pick 5 years, 7 years, something like that, 10 years out of the hat. In some cases, the state begins to somewhat formally recognize, not informally, but formally recognize that particular couple in what we call a common law marriage. I'm sure a lot of y'all have heard of that before. When that happens, a divorce is the legal undoing of that common law assumed state of marriage between the two people. There was never a ceremony, there was never a marriage license purchased, there was never any of that stuff that happened. But if a state, which in the United States, individual states are allowed to have varying, V-A-R-Y, varying rules about these kinds of things. A colleague of mine, way back in my University of West Florida days, moved from Colorado, where there was a common law statute, and he and his wife moved to Pensacola, Florida from Colorado, and he was attempting to add her to his new insurance at school, but Florida does not recognize common law marriage. So even though they had been living together, cohabitating for 24 years, I think it was, he could not, add her to his benefits at work because she was not legally his wife in Florida. So it's a big deal, marriage, whether you go through the channels where you buy the license, where you pay, the licensed professional to marry you, and all these kinds of steps that we discussed in our last video together. Divorce is the legal undoing of that legal arrangement called marriage. Whether the marriage goes through those steps or is merely a common law marriage because of decades of, in some cases, decades of cohabitation. So, this rounds out the marriage and family and intimate relationship discussion that we're going to have together. There's information about blended families and step families and all that kind of stuff in your textbook. And the next time we see each other, I will talk about another social institution and how it overlaps with the economy or marriage or family or education or any number of other social institutions to affect our lives on the micro scale and how our daily experiences are designed. So I will see you soon. Thank you for your attention. Text me with questions. Bye.